Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Ms. Beryl Menzies, one of the experts instructed to help the inquiry. Would you ask Ms. Menzies to come back in, please? Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Menzies.
Good morning.
All ready to carry on?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Grogan.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Menzies.
Good morning.
We left off yesterday where we'd started to look at the specifics of the design of the system, and I'm just going to continue with that topic for a little longer. In your supplementary report, you explain your view that the PSB technical submission for the smoke control system, as conditionally accepted by Building Control in Revision 3, was acceptable in principle.
Yes.
And in paragraph 304, we don't have to go to it, but the reference for the transcript is BMER 607, page 69. You say that by this you mean a performance-based strategy was acceptable in the circumstances of an existing building with retained smoke extract shafts. Can you just confirm what you mean when you say performance-based?
The system had to achieve a criteria of the airflow through the door, and the system would have to be designed to achieve that and to demonstrate that. Yesterday made reference to the airflow through the grills. That would have a bearing on achieving that performance standard, but it would be variable and possibly depend from floor to floor to achieve it, because that would have to be, as all part of the commission, which I'm sure we'll touch on, demonstrated at each floor level.
And when you say a performance-based strategy was acceptable, are you saying that this approach was acceptable, or is it your view that the specific design as presented to the BCB was acceptable?
The approach was acceptable. It's outlined in the guidance in various documents, and the choice of the airflow through the door at 2 metres per second was in a recognised, substantiated code, and in my view that was an acceptable rate of flow for a performance.
And in terms of the proposed system, is it right that whilst it may not have been intended as a full depressurisation system that complied with BSEN 12101-6, it was a system that created a pressure differential in the lobby?
Yes, it did. It created a reduction of pressure in the lobby.
And at paragraph 120 of your report, which is page 19 for the transcript, you say you do not believe that the intent of the design proposal was full compliance with BSEN 12101-6.
Correct.
If we could look at paragraph 123 of your report, which is on the same page, that's page 19. You say there no guidance existed to address the Grenfell Tower proposal, a partially retained system that was to be modified. The adoption of any particular guidance is not mandatory to achieve compliance with the building regulations. And as outlined in my main report, and you give some references there, an applicant is at liberty to choose how to achieve compliance. The building regulation requirements B1 through to B5 are substantive and not prescriptive. The guidance must be appropriate for the situation. No one document is subjugated by another, but one guidance document may be predominantly relevant and form the basis of a proposal with benefit from others. However, it should be remembered that guidance is based on the assumption that its interrelated measures are adopted, and cherry-picking from numerous documents is unacceptable without justification and can be inappropriate. It could be said that taking just one aspect of BSEN 12101-6 was cherry-picking. What's your view on that?
In the context I view cherry-picking, it was not. It was a performance that was considered by the BSI as achieving an appropriate level for means of escape and for firefighting, which was required in this instance. The means of achieving that was via equipment and design that was achieving a depressurisation, but not in the context of the BSEN 12101-6, in as much as I had never seen a depressurisation system in accordance with that guidance ever proposed in a residential situation. It would not have been appropriate to do so. It would have taken substantial alterations. Similarly, a pressurisation system, again a differential system, would not have been appropriate at Grenfell Tower or, in my opinion, any other residential situation.
And why is that?
Depressurisation generally requires extract of the smoke from the fire cell, the room of origin, if you like, of the fire, which would not have been appropriate in a flat. Pressurisation is an excellent form of smoke control, but it requires a very high standard of maintenance. If the doors that are forming the barriers that maintain the pressurisation and the differentials, etc., are under frequent use, they become worn, then requiring more maintenance. The testing of it can become quite annoying to residents because of the fans starting up, etc. And it's a high level of capital outlay and a high level of ongoing maintenance.
In terms of the actual design of the system, Dr. Lane has set out her view regarding the system in detail in her Phase 2 report. She concludes that the Grenfell Tower smoke control system did not comply with the requirements of Schedule 1 of the building regulations, B1, B3 and B5, when handed over to the TMO. And we'll go to the detail of her conclusions in a moment. Have you had the opportunity to acquaint yourself with Dr. Lane's conclusions in her report?
I've looked at all 500 and odd pages, yes.
If we could go to a summary of her conclusions, which are at BLARP2, 5036, page 25. So this is in chapter 10 of her smoke control report. She concludes there at 10.13.2 that she's found no evidence that either set of performance standards, and she's referring there to both CP3 1971 and ADB, were considered as a means to derive design objectives, nor were criteria set on that basis. Do you agree with her conclusion there?
I don't really understand the reference to CP3. There were aspects of Grenfell Tower that complied with CP3. The smoke control in the lobby did not comply with CP3, but had been accepted as a reasonable provision under the legislation at the time by the authorities having jurisdiction.
And what about her criticism that they didn't use ADB to derive any type of design objective?
ADB did not really address mechanical systems. It spoke about alternative to natural systems, but didn't give it any technical data for the system other than by reference to other documents.
She goes on to say at 10.13.4 that mechanical extract only systems are agreed to be inappropriate for the protective purpose of means of escape, and no consideration was given to this during the Grenfell Tower primary refurbishment. Do you agree with that?
I think Dr. Lane's referring to depressurisation. This was not a full depressurisation system. It was a mechanical extract system that afforded a level of depressurisation in the lobby.
And at 10.13.5, she says that RBKC Building Control correctly requested a performance-based design as a route to compliance by means of the SCA guide. However, she's not found any evidence that PSB's lobby smoke control system was designed on that basis.
I do not recollect any disclosure that Building Control requested a performance-based design. It requested details of the existing system to show it was a no worsening situation, or as an alternative, it requested details of a new system. The observations provided by Mr. Hanson, the RBKC expert in the field of the smoke control, stated that he based his actual observations B1 being a wider than the smoke control alone on ADB and BS 9991 as appropriate. He did recommend that the components of the system accorded with the SCA guide, and the SCA guide in turn referred to other documents for standards to be attained, etc.
She also concludes at 10.13.6 that the commissioning process fell below the standard to be expected. She says there that it did not demonstrate compliance with Regulation 7 of the building regulations. Do you agree with that?
The commissioning process, as I understand the commissioning process, is merely to demonstrate that the system works as intended. The reason building control bodies generally do not attend commissioning processes is that they take so long, they can be very time-consuming, very intense, lots of people involved, particularly when there are a number of floors that need to be addressed at the same time. And the actual standards of the equipment, etc., should have been dealt with as they were installed and checked by the installation engineers as being adequate. The compliance with Regulation 7 is basically they are being fit for purpose and are installed in a workmanlike manner, and that should have been addressed all the way through the construction. At the commissioning, it's too late. And as I understand it, commissioning engineers who may have never seen the site before are not looking at the standards of the equipment, but making sure that they are literally wired up correctly and running in the correct order, etc.
She also concludes at 10.13.7 that the fire performance standard for the dampers, most importantly, as well as the newly installed portions of the ductwork, did not comply with either the performance standards for a smoke control system nor the requirements for a protected shaft.
I would agree with that, and from all the disclosures I have seen, there is no evidence that building control sought clarification and sought test certificates or anything associated with establishing the performance of those dampers.
So does that lead you then to also conclude that there were non-compliances with B1 and B5?
Yes, because there was no conclusion that indicated that there was full compliance.
And in those circumstances, should building control have rejected the proposal or at least not issued a final certificate?
Not issued a final certificate, which I have stated in my supplementary report.
In the event that the panel accepts Dr. Lane's conclusions there that the system did not comply in other ways with B1 and B5, is that something that you think building control ought to have picked up?
I would have to know what those particular aspects were. From the regulatory side, the system as installed was not shown to be compliant because it was altered after building control last saw it demonstrated. And I'm still confused as to what these additional vents that were requested by building control were and at what stage they were requested and whether they had ever been mentioned before, because there is a disclosure that says building control agreed that we didn't need a vent. Then we get the request after the demonstration for the additional vent, and the S2, I believe from memory, annotation by building control on the drawings includes inlet vents to lobby at the lower level. So I'm very confused as to what was actually thought to be required and what was actually installed at the final completion.
And we'll come on to that topic and look at Mr. Hansen's evidence on that slightly later this morning. Moving on to a new topic now, which is the Smoke Control Association guidance. Paragraphs 121 and 122 of your report, which is on page 19, you explain that the recommendations of the various BSEN 1201 specifications relating to the installation components, testing and maintenance were relevant and were similarly referenced in the Smoke Control Association guidance. And you say, in my experience, the SCA guidance was generally recognised as authoritative and relevant and was applied to smoke control schemes at the time of the full plan submissions. There was no other performance-based guidance available, and BS 12101-6 provided a performance criteria. Moving on in your report to page 55, paragraph 219, you also say there that you consider the SCA guidance was an appropriate reference in the circumstances. There was no other performance-related guidance and no guidance that specifically related to existing buildings. Can you explain to what extent you would have expected building control to consider the proposal against the SCA guidance? So it's acceptable in principle as a starting off point, but how would you expect them to follow it through?
Well, the SCA guidance addressed mechanical extract natural inlet as a system of smoke control. It was also guidance that was more recent in its version. 12101-6 is getting quite old now. And it was guidance that was compiled by persons and organisations who were literally at the coalface dealing with these installations on a day-to-day basis, and was contributed to by building control bodies and the fire service, who would be one of the end users.
It's right, though, that the SCA guidance also sets out a process for arriving at your final design.
It does.
Would you expect the BCB to insist upon that process being followed? So selecting your performance criteria and justifying them?
Not insisting, because they can't insist. It would be a case of, if you followed this guidance, that would be something we would be supportive of in our overview, and it would make sense for you to do it. Particularly in this case when Mr. Hanson was actually sitting on the committee. But irrespective of that, it was something that gave a constructive process by which people could relate to a process as submitted to building control.
And Mr. Hanson's confirmed his view in his witness statement. For the transcript, the references RBK 3033894, page 9, paragraph 52, that the new smoke control system was designed in accordance with the principles of the 2012 revision of the SCA guide. Mr. Mani, however, said that the system was not designed in accordance with the SCA guide process. And the reference for that is day 155, page 135, line 20, when he was asked whether the system was meant to be designed in accordance with the process set out in the SCA guide. He said no, because we couldn't follow it. Given the conflict of evidence there, how do you reconcile the fact that Mr. Hanson, on the one hand, thought that that's what was being followed, but Mr. Mani says it wasn't? The
SCA guide puts great emphasis on CFD, which was decided not to be done at Grenfell Tower. Mr. Mani's statement, I believe, related to the fact that he designed it from the basic principle of achieving a flow rate, which the SCA guide then directs you back to 12101-6 for pressure differential systems. But the SCA guidance was more akin to what was being proposed. Mr. Mani's proposal didn't set out on what it was based, but then neither did the building control documents that have been made available, and the records cannot be found. There's no record of what the discussions were held, what was said between the parties, and why the conclusion was drawn. But looking at it, if you like, as a separate review, it seemed appropriate to me for the purposes of the building regulations.
If we could just look at the SCA Guide 2012 and one particular aspect of it, it's clause 5.3.1, which is an LFB 3059241, page 10. And it says there, design conditions, right at the bottom, design conditions and performance criteria should be agreed with the approving authority as part of the approval process, preferably in advance of any detailed calculation or modelling. Is it clear to you, having looked at the documentation, what design conditions and performance criteria were agreed in advance for Grenfell Tower?
Not what was agreed in advance of the submission of revision 03. I do know that a clause was removed from revision 02, where I think there was a typing error anyway, because it said it extracted into the staircase, which was obviously totally unacceptable. But the reference saying it wasn't designed to 12101, etc., was removed as well. So a correction would have been better, but the whole sentence, the paragraph was removed. But the justification for the removal was only a comment by Rights saying that they had spoken to building control, and Mr. Hanson said, this is not what we agreed. But I can't make out from the disclosures whether the extraction into the staircase was which was the question that Mr. Hanson was raising, or the whole paragraph in its entirety, because there's no explanation from either as to why.
Just focusing on the idea that design conditions and performance criteria should be agreed with the approving authority, do you see any evidence that that was positively done?
Not recorded as such, no. Whether it was discussed and not recorded, I don't know.
Are you critical of that failure to record that process had been carried out?
Yes, yes, because it's a record leading up to the decision. But then, as we never had a decision on the overall project, this standalone aspect is probably the most detailed recording, but it has gaps in leading up to why that particular process was adopted.
And why would it be important to record what had been agreed?
Because it's a record that shows why it was installed. It's a record that shows that building control had done its due diligence in its job, if you like. And it's also a record for those that come after the installation has been installed and been running for some time. If, for instance, a component is no longer available, you can look at what's gone before, what was discussed, why it was achieved, and if the variation that you're now compelled to incorporate in the system will have a detrimental effect on it.
If we could look now at clause 5.4.
I'm sorry, can I just interrupt you for a second to ask this? I can understand that the questions about the design of the system may be interesting, may be important, as may be questions of record keeping. But from the point of view of compliance with the building regulations, does it matter so long as the airflow was achieved in practice?
In practice, no.
Right.
But it is always good practice, whether you're on the building control side or on the design side, to record the route that you went to achieve what you did.
Yeah, I don't dispute that for a moment. I just want to be clear, though, because sometimes one gets confusion between it's not recorded and whether it happened.
Yes.
And, of course, we do have the data from the commissioning exercise, which presumably would be available subsequently if anyone wanted to know how it had performed.
Yes. Yes.
So to some extent, there's a record of actual performance, even if not a record of how you got to that point.
The record of the actual performance is indication that the system achieved the design, which is what you want to know.
Well, it's a record, is it not, of the fact that the system achieved a performance level which satisfied the building regulations.
Yes, correct.
Now, it may also have achieved the design if you know what the design was, but that doesn't detract from the fact that it achieved what was required to satisfy the building regulations.
Exactly that, because it was accepted, that design criteria was accepted as satisfying the building regulations. Yes.
Yeah, all right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm sorry, Ms. Grogan.
Thank you. So we were just about to look at clause 5.4 of the SCA guide, which is on page 14 of this same document. And it's the bottom half of the page there. And we can see that the documentation required by the SCA guide to allow relevant parties to assess the analysis undertaken in relation to checking and meeting the required performance criteria should include at least, and then there's a list, a description of the residential area and the proposed ventilation system, the design criteria and performance objectives of the analysis, the scenarios investigated, details of the techniques used and related information, and over the page, the results of the analysis and a statement as to whether the design criteria and objectives have been met. Mr. Hanson, in his evidence, suggested that this list was in relation to modelling a scenario rather than considering a performance-based criteria. And the reference for the transcript is day 154, page 190, lines 2 to 8. Can you help us, if one was following the SCA guide in establishing performance criteria, as we've just discussed and as you've just had an exchange with the chairman about, would you expect that information to have been provided for Grenfell?
I think to a level it was provided. If we can go back a page. A description of the residential area and the proposed ventilation system. There was a description of that, a high level, and I think it would be acceptable to assume that this coming after the main submission of the full plans and plans of the proposed works having been submitted, that people involved, including building control, had an awareness of the residential area and the proposed ventilation system. The design criteria was the performance criteria, as was the objective. The analysis leading up to that may be a little vague in the paperwork. The scenarios investigated, there was only one scenario, and that was a fire in a flat and persons leaving, and the whole concept of stay in place had been described previously. Details of the techniques used and related information, I'm not quite sure what that would be. That's probably where the reference to modelling, etc., by Mr. Hanson is. And if we can go down the page. The results of the analysis was the calculation that was done by Mr. Marnie and the aspirational flow that was achieved by the commissioning certificate at the time, although it must be noted that that was not the final system that was installed.
When this list of matters that should be addressed was put to Mr. Hanson, he acknowledged that it should have been documented better how the considerations were arrived at, and the reference for that is day 154, page 191, lines 3 to 6. In light of his acceptance that things could have been done better, was it right for building control to proceed to approve the system in the absence of proper recording?
For the purpose of the building regulations, I think yes, in as much as the building regulations were looking for a result to be achieved, and that result was achieved at the time, but not the final system, because that was never recorded.
So, as you said in your evidence before, the focus is on what happened at commissioning and was it demonstrated that this flow rate was achieved, rather than when looking at it on paper in advance whether all of the information was there to permit building control to carry out an assessment.
Yeah, the looking at it in advance gives an indication that it's viable and will fulfil the function of the building regulations. If it showed a total non-compliance or something that didn't fulfil or aim to fulfil the function of the building regulations, it could have been rejected at that point. Although this proposal would have been rejected on the basis that it's unacceptable, not this, your full plans application is rejected. In this particular case, the full plans application was never passed or approved. It went outside the time limit. No overall view of building control on the proposed project was ever given. So it would have been, this is unacceptable. And if they said, oh, well, we're going to proceed with it anyway, then it would be a case of, well, we'll see on site what is actually produced and whether that is adequate.
In circumstances where a design criteria or performance criteria is put forward, but as we've discussed, not explained or justified, and building control looks at it, and then you get to site and something goes wrong, is it not too late by the time you've got to site and the commissioning process?
It is too late. In the case of Grenfell, I would have said, although there was not the detailed analysis and the whole matrix, if you like, of how I arrived at this decision, there was nothing to say this will not perform on site. There was nothing to say this is totally wrong. I think, as Mr. Marnie said, a lot of it was based on his experience, and he didn't put it down on paper. And perhaps Mr. Hanson, in his experience, knew that the intent would work, although he suddenly decided towards the end, although the commissioning demonstrated the flow was achieved, that he thought there should be and recommended additional ventilation at ground level.
At paragraph 183 of your report, which is on page 52 of BMER 607, you say that the PSB technical submission Rev 3 does not state that it's based on, reliant on, or has adopted the SEA guidance, and the guidance is not quoted anywhere in the document. Should it have done so?
Mr. Marnie said it wasn't based on the SCA guidance. On that basis, no, it wouldn't have been. The conditional approval, if you like, of revision 03 stated that it should comply with the components aspect as recommended in SCA guidance. So then, if you like, that almost became conditional of it. But if it was proven that it hadn't followed it, but was adequate in any event, then the system finally would have been accepted.
And moving on in your report to page 54, paragraphs 211 and 212, thinking about the proposal as it came across Mr. Hanson's desk, you said there are several aspects that you would have expected to be queried by an experienced BCB surveyor. And they are, did the proposals follow any aspect of the SCA guidance? Mr. Hanson having stated that the proposed system was designed in accordance with that guidance, and if so, why was it not referenced in the technical submission? What was the temperature rating of the smoke extract fans? What was the fire resistance of the proposed dampers to the smoke extract shafts? And were the dampers to the smoke extract shafts the fire and smoke dampers required to maintain compartmentation and deter smoke spread? And then you go on to say you've seen no disclosure that indicates that these issues were queried at the time of the BCB review. In light of your view that those matters were not queried, should building control have accepted the proposal in principle?
Accepted it in principle, but I should have queried those aspects, and that could have been part of the conditional approval. The aspect I highlighted in my main report, where the division of Mr. Hanson and Mr. Hoban, Mr. Hanson being a consultant to Mr. Hoban, the smoke extract shaft dampers, etc., were relevant under requirement B3 as well. So one of the two should have been looking at them. Mr. Hanson said he never carried out any site inspections, so implying, in my view, that Mr. Hoban should have been looking at the fire rating of the dampers. So this is where this confusion arises on several aspects of the building regulations review of the whole project. But those are matters which should, in my view, have been queried, would have been beneficial to both parties to have known at the time prior to installation. But all the building control body can do is ask for that information. If the scheme proceeds and that information is not forthcoming, they can't stop it. All they can say at the end is, well, basically, we warned you. Now, because we don't know if these dampers are adequate, we need you to prove it, or you replace them with something that we both agree is acceptable.
And I think it's right that there's no evidence that happened, so there was no querying later on.
Not that I've seen.
Of the dampers and no request to install something different. In those circumstances, should building control at the end of the process have issued its certificate? So in the absence of information that you've listed there?
No, they should not. I think I said in my main report that the completion certificate should not have been issued. The aspect of the smoke control was only one part of that recommendation, that they should not have issued it, or conclusion rather.
Moving on to a new topic, which is extended travel distances. Can we go first to ADB, which is CLG 50224, and this is the 2006 edition incorporating the 2007, 2010 and 2013 amendments. Go to page 31. And we zoom in on 2.25, which is at the top of the page. It says there should therefore be some means of ventilating the common corridors, lobbies to control smoke and so protect the common stairs. This offers additional protection to that provided by the fire doors to the stair. Brackets, the ventilation also affords some protection to the corridors/lobbies. And then it says this can be achieved by one of two ways, natural or mechanical. Is it correct that this is drawing attention to the need to ventilate both, to ventilate the common lobbies, first of all, so to protect the stairs, but second of all, also to provide some protection to the lobbies themselves?
Yes.
And is it right that what the guidance is saying there is that you need to think about the escape route in its entirety, so a single-minded focus on the stairs would not be appropriate?
You would consider the escape from the room within the flat, through the flat hall, through the common horizontal areas, down the stair, right out to somebody standing outside in the fresh air.
And that would apply whether or not travel distances are extended?
Correct.
If we go now to the 2015 version of the SCA guide, which is RBK 402932, page 6. Now, we've heard the evidence, and you've said in your report that it's the 2012 guide that would have applied to the assessment of the smoke control system, but the 2015 guide expresses the principle as well, which is why I've taken you to it. It says at the beginning of the section titled Primary Objectives, where the travel distances are no more than 7.5 metres in distance from the door to the staircase, brackets, or sterile lobby, the most remote apartment entrance door, the primary objective of smoke control in residential buildings is to protect the staircase enclosure by ensuring that the stairways remain relatively free from smoke and heat in the event of a fire within a dwelling. And it goes on to say, however, where corridors are extended, the primary objective of the smoke control system is to protect both the common corridor and the staircase enclosure. there are considered to be two forms of extended corridors. And then it goes on to define extended travel distances of typically no more than 15 metres, and then significantly extended travel distances which have more than 15 metres travel distance. So if you keep that in mind, we'll now look at one further standard, which is clause 0.2.3 of BS 9991 2011, and that is BSI 50621, page 11. And at 0.23, it says, in the second paragraph, smoke can be controlled in the common areas through fitted ventilation systems, which are either natural or mechanical. These ventilation systems have two main purposes, the first of which is to provide some protection to the stair core, and the second of which is to aid firefighters when tackling a fire. Ventilation systems can also be used to compensate for extended travel distances within the common corridor leading to the stairs and thereby help occupants to escape safely. Where smoke control is used to provide compensation for extended travel distances, it is the responsibility of the designers to demonstrate that the ventilation system can provide tenable conditions, brackets see Annex E, close brackets, for the occupants using the route with extended travel distances. Do you agree that, therefore, ADB, the SCA Guide 2015 and BS 9991 all anticipate the use of a smoke control system to protect not just the stair but also the common corridor?
In the context of an extended travel distance, yes, the smoke ventilation system will also afford some protection to the common lobby. And I say lobby in the context of Grenfell because it was not a corridor as such, and there's a big debate as to what's a lobby and what's a corridor. In my view, a corridor is longer and bigger than a lobby. You will, by virtue of the smoke control system running, have some degree of protection in that protected lobby, whether the travel distance is 7.5 or longer. The whole aspect has to be considered in the concept, recognising the concept of how these recommendations are compiled on the basis of the stay-in-place protocol and the compartmentation, the fact that the flat on fire will be the initial flat and perhaps, hopefully, the only flat necessary to evacuate. Therefore, when they evacuate, they open the door to the flat, which should be a fire-resistant, self-closing, smoke-sealed door. They will come into the common area. They have left their flat because they have either seen the fire, noticed smoke, or have been warned of fire by virtue of the smoke detection in their flat activating. And that should activate in the early stages of the fire so that they should be leaving the flat in the early stages of the fire. That flat entrance door closes behind them, should close behind them. If sufficient smoke has escaped from the flat to activate the smoke detector in the common area, that ventilation system, that smoke control system will activate. They then move into the stair and go down and evacuate the building. Should anybody else on the floor become aware of a fire and feel the need to evacuate, when they come out into that lobby, that smoke control system may or may not be running. If it's running, it will be pulling air from the stair, from gaps under the door, etc. When the door is opened into the stair, it will boost up and further dilute the smoke in the lobby. But it would be a limited amount of smoke in the common lobby, provided the front door to the fire flat had closed. So there is a level of protection, but it is recognised in guidance and commentary, and I think generally known throughout the industry, that during firefighting, the only practical way of holding the smoke back from entering the stair to a degree is if the stair is part of a pressurization system that will hold the smoke back. Otherwise, it is inevitable that smoke will pass into the common stair. Now, should the fire brigade determine that further persons need to evacuate, their decision as to whether to close the door to the stair, close the door to the flat, stop firefighting at that particular time while persons evacuate is entirely up to them, and it's a dynamic decision. Only they can decide.
But in circumstances where there are extended travel distances, it is right that the guidance points to the fact that the lobby, the smoke control system should protect the lobby as well as the stair.
Yes, and it should achieve certain levels of tenability, temperature, visibility, which is not specified for a code-compliant distance. So not all new projects adhere strictly to the 7.5 metres travel distance, because 7.5 metres, as probably has been said, will be adequate for Joe Public, perhaps not somebody who has breathing difficulties, has just come back from skiing, has broken their leg, etc., or is of a certain age, or has some form of impairment. So it's, a metre, half a metre each way is probably not going to make much difference. I'm sure the panel has been informed, the inquiry has been informed. At one point we had mandatory rules for means of escape, way back from the 1985 regulations. That was done away with. One reason, I believe, was because it was very rigid and did not allow circumstances where a slight extension would be adequate. But definitely if it goes up towards 15 metres, or perhaps even sort of 10 or so metres, you would be then start looking in an extended travel distance situation for those tenability criteria to be demonstrated, and that is usually done by CFD. In the case of Grenfell, in my view, the travel distances were not extended because they complied with the criteria when it was built. So whilst in the context of modern standards it was extended and it approached the magic 15 metre distance, depending on how you were permitted under CP3 to go up to 15. I know that the BRE measured that travel distance. I know Dr. Lane measured it. I have measured it on the plans from scale, and we've come up with 3 different versions of how far that distance is. It's not unusual in scaling to get an incorrect distance, but it gives you an indication. And that's what you do when you do the plans under building regs. You're doing the review, you're scaling it, or you're taking dimensions that are put on the plan by the architect. So in particular in Grenfell Tower, the distance, which was not 15 metres, it was less, would have been permitted under CP3 at the time.
So just going back to BS 9991, where it says it's the responsibility of designers to demonstrate that the ventilation system can provide tenable conditions for the occupants, using the route with extended travel distances. Is it your view that for Grenfell Tower, that piece of guidance didn't apply, so there was no requirement for the designer to demonstrate that tenable conditions in the common lobbies could be achieved?
Had I been looking at it, I wouldn't have raised the matter of extended travel distance as being a criteria which they would now have to address under the new proposals, the refurbishment proposals. I readily acknowledge some others, another building control officer may have in fact raised it as an issue. If they were looking at distances of 15 metres, if a building control officer had raised it, they would, if following the guidance at that time, would have been putting sprinklers in all the flats, which would not have been viable from the proposals, the building owner's point of view perhaps. But I personally would not have considered it being an extended travel distance in the context of Grenfell Tower.
you refer to what you personally would have done. Is that a matter that there's a range of reasonable views? So bearing in mind the standard of a reasonably competent BCB, would it be within the range of reasonable responses for a BCB to query the travel distances and ask for a demonstration that at Grenfell Tower, those extended travel distances could still provide tenable conditions with the smoke control system?
In all honesty, I can't give you a view on that, in as much as these systems, as exactly as per Grenfell Tower, I've never seen another one in existence, so I couldn't say, in all honesty. It's down to personal judgment and interpretation by the building control body.
And Mr. Hanson's evidence was that in the context of protecting the common corridor, where there were these extended travel distances but less than 15 metres, he described that as a qualitative decision not based on any kind of modelling or anything of that nature. And that's at day 154, page 168, lines 2 to 25. Does that reflect what you've just said, that it's a matter of professional judgment as to how you approach it as a BCB?
Yes.
I'm going to ask you now about the shape of the lobby, so the eye shape of the lobby. We've heard evidence in relation to that. And in his evidence, Mr. Mani, on day 155, page 88, lines 4 to 7, which we don't need to go to, said, the system I'm putting forward isn't designed to deal with the eye-shaped lobby, and no system will remove those dead spots, whether it be natural or mechanical, because it's a dead spot. Is that an issue you would have expected to see considered in the design documentation?
Again, ideally, it would have been part of a discussion, recorded or set out in the document. However, in the case of the layout of Grenfell Tower, unlike most modern layouts that comply with the travel distance or not, you are actually extracting in 2 points. So you were drawing away from 2 points, some of which were quite near these dead ends. I'm not convinced that the dead end situation would have been significant. It would add to my view that, as was usual in these circumstances, you would have requested demonstration of a cold smoke test to show what the situation was with the flow of smoke away from the stair, etc. The layout of the opposing extract and the proximity to the dead ends would, in my view, have likely resulted in some movement, but as to whether it would have been at a level that would have been demonstrated as being, giving the visibility that one would expect or the guidance gives you, I don't know. Mr. Marnie's experience as an engineer, a mechanical engineer, dealing with air movement, smoke control systems, far exceeds mine. So I can't say whether or not it would have. If that was his stance, then I would have expected that to have been recorded in the discussions and addressed. But I don't think it played a significant role in the system that he designed. There's nothing to direct me towards saying this was a system that would deal with, well, as he said, it wouldn't deal with the aspects of the dead-end situations.
And in those circumstances, should the BCB have thought about whether or not that affected compliance with B1 and B5?
You would always consider dead-end situations in the context of smoke movement, but as the prime concern was to protect the stair, and in my view there were not extensive dead ends, I can understand why it was not apparently considered under the proposals at Grenfell to any high degree, but it would have been a general aspect that you would consider as a building control officer in any project with smoke control. The same would arise for a natural system as well as a mechanical system.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because the dead ends, if we're going to call them that, were built into the structure, weren't they?
Yes.
And therefore, and because the new system was drawing or designed to draw smoke from 2 locations in the lobby rather than just one, presumably it was no more unsatisfactory than the original arrangement.
In my view, it would have been better.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
In which case, there wasn't much that building control could say about it, was there?
Not really, no.
No. All right, thank you.
Is that right even in circumstances where they were applying modern standards, so they were seeking achievement of B1 and B5?
I think the applying modern standards was aspirational, but in an existing building, it would be rare that you could apply all modern standards. In this particular case, the size of the vent shafts didn't comply with any guidance at all. And although I hesitate to raise the COLT system, which has been discussed at length in Dr. Lane's, well, not at length, but has been addressed in Dr. Lane's report, the reason people often go for the COLT system is that the vent duct is smaller than the recommendation, but it's been shown to work on a certain layout. It's all the CFD analysis has been done, which is expensive and can run for weeks to get an answer, has been done. So people sometimes opt for that for the smaller size vent shaft. In this case, I don't think they even added up to the COLT size shaft.
And in circumstances where you have the dead end and there's a potential for smoke not to be cleared from that dead end, how can the BCB satisfy itself that there would be an adequate means of escape through the lobby and out to the stair?
If the BCB was concerned that there was a dead end situation where there would be a lack of dilution in that area, in order to request substantiation that it was not a problem, they'd have to establish that there was a problem in the first case. In the situation of a layout with dead ends, you would consider the escape from the individual flats on the basis of a stay in place. And then you would say I think you would surmise that had the dead end situation been an issue, it would have been because it wasn't the fire flat that was escaping. The fire and the smoke should be behind you and you're running ahead of it. It would have been a situation if the fire flat fire had caused an issue within the common lobby and the residents on the same floor were trying to escape through that lobby. But in the case of an existing situation, it would have been an issue as originally approved, as opposed at the same time as being the proposed scheme. There was no worsening, if you like, of the situation. And because you were now going from natural to mechanical, you were probably improving the situation in the lobby for that other flat occupants to escape.
Moving on to foreseeable scenarios and door opening conditions now. At paragraph 116 of your report, which is on page 18, you say there that SCA guidance makes no specific recommendations relating to firefighting operations, and you've said this in oral evidence today. These will be dynamic at each incident, but an experienced, competent BCB should be aware that it is likely firefighters will approach a fire from a floor or floors below where they have connected hoses to the rising water main, and the hoses will retain open doors between the lobbies and the stair. And then going forwards in your report to page 65, at paragraph 271, it says, whilst neither version of the SCA guidance specifically stated the stair doors on the lower floors should be considered as being open in addition to those at the level of the fire, a competent building control surveyor familiar with smoke control systems supporting firefighting operations and the particular scenarios associated with a Class B installation would have been aware of the need to consider additional doors being open. And then at paragraph 275, which is on the same page at the bottom, you say you've seen no disclosure that suggests the BCB required open doors other than on the fire floor as part of the commissioning of the system or the witnessing of the system, and there's no indication that the BCB took these additional doors into consideration when reviewing the smoke control proposal. Is it right then that you would have expected a reasonably competent BCB to have required the commissioning or testing process to address different door opening scenarios?
Yes, and in witnessing the demonstration, I would have expected them to have asked for certain doors to be held open on the lower floors to demonstrate the effect. It was not a commissioning matter, in as much as it was not part of the design as I understand it.
Can you help me with this? Because I'm sure the lack of understanding on my part, but as I understand it, the system is designed to draw air from the stairway into the lobby and thereafter up the shaft. Why does it matter where the air has come from when it emerges from the stair shaft into the lobby?
I'm not a mechanical engineer, but my understanding is that this whole system works on balancing, and therefore it would be just to demonstrate that there was not an imbalance of the airflows through from the stair through the doors. But also it would be an indication of where the likely direction of flow would be. If it would this influx of air cause any additional drawing from the fire flat? But
At the moment, I can't see how it could, because effectively you're just drawing air from the whole of the stairwell, and the stairwell is open to the atmosphere at the top, so in one sense you're drawing air on the face of it
from practical
from everywhere, and I can't see why having a door open on the floor above or the floor below should affect the rate of flow through the door you're concerned about.
I
I
agree.
thought Mr. Marnie said it wouldn't, but I may have misunderstood. This is why I was asking the question.
From my understanding of the way these systems work, I doubt whether it would have affected it, but it would be a demonstration of what would be happening on the night of the fire with the fire brigade holding doors open.
Yeah.
It's a bit different in Grenfell in as much as under current guidance, the brigade prefer, and the guidance is, that the dry riser or the wet riser is in the stair.
Yeah.
Under previous guidance, it asked for it to be in a ventilated, protected space, and in this case, it was the lobby as opposed to the stair. So the actual performance, that's the wrong word, the operations of the fire brigade on the night of the fire incident would have been different to what would have been set out in the actual guidance. And the guidance changed, and the acknowledgement of the two crews was different to the original concept for Grenfell Tower. The two crews followed the 9/11 incident. My understanding is, having spoken to firemen for many, many years and read the reports post 9/11, in that the temperatures that were reached, the crew that fights the fire is effectively protected by the second crew. And I'm sure this has been explained to the panel, by spraying above their heads so the hot gases don't affect them. Because as good as their suits are, from temperature-wise, they were in London anyway at one time known as boil in the bag suits, because they don't wick the temperature from the body and the perspiration. So post 9/11, it was established that probably the maximum a firefighter at the face of a fire could withstand from a durability point of view, not only from heat but exhaustion as well, was about 17 minutes. So obviously the crews need to be given additional protection, etc. Sorry, I've gone off a tangent.
All right, I invited you to.
But yes,
I think I understand. I mean, I think what you're telling me is that it would have been good practice for building control to have asked for a demonstration with other doors open,
yeah.
even though you don't think it was likely to have made any difference.
I thought, but couldn't categorically say no. The other aspect that is in my mind, when you're adopting a flow criteria taken from that particular BS, is that recommends that you do consider other doors being opened. So whether or not it would have a practical effect, others more qualified should give the definitive answer. But I did note when looking at the draft document, which is in the BSEN 101-6 series, which I think is 13, which reflects this type of system, there was, in my reading of it, and it was only a draft, no recommendation for additional doors on other levels being open to be considered.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Scroden.
For the transcript, we can, well, I'll just give you the reference. It's clause 12.2.3.3 of BSEN 12101-6, which is RBK 3045054 at page 73. There's a list there of the different door opening scenarios that should be opened during the test.
For a pressurisation system,
For
yes.
a pressurisation system. I just want to ask you about one particular scenario. So where a door to the fire flat is open and a window in that flat is broken or is otherwise open, can you help us on whether the exposure of the system to outside air through the window would negatively affect the 2 metres per second flow rate at the stair door?
No, I can't help you. I'm not qualified to make that judgment.
Would you expect a reasonably competent BCB to have required the commissioning process to have demonstrated that in that scenario, the 2 metres per second was still achieved?
A competent BCB with a basic knowledge of fire would, I think, be expected to know that a window to a flat could be open, or that the fire may, and it doesn't happen in every case, cause a window to fail. In the context of the door being open, the safety of the residents, that would have been a transient risk because that door should have closed after them and therefore protected everybody else using that same level. It may have marginally, if the window was open or failed, been another leakage path, but it would have been directing the fire and the heat out of the window. So it would have been a balance, I would imagine. I'm not qualified to give you the full scientific facts on that.
Mr. Hanson said in his oral evidence that he expected that door testing would be done to the British standard, which is the standard we've just discussed, which refers to the different door opening scenarios. And for the transcript, that was day 154, page 197, lines 12 to 15. Was it reasonable for Mr. Hampton to make that assumption without seeing positive evidence that it had in fact been done?
No. A wise man once said to me, it's unsafe to assume anything.
When you say that guidance to which we've just been referred refers to a pressurisation system, are we to think of pressurising the staircase in this context?
A pressurisation system is different to what was proposed.
Quite.
you would pressurise the stair, you would pressurise the lobby, and you would pressurise the lift.
Right.
And it's, as I hope I've illustrated, it's a very delicately balanced system. Therefore, if you open doors on other levels,
Well,
then it's going to affect it.
that's what I was wondering, you see, because if BS EN 12101 is concerned with pressurization systems and you're applying it to a staircase and pressurizing the staircase, then it would not strike me as surprising that if you open doors in several places on the staircase, you're likely to affect the pressurization because you're offering
Yes.
exit paths for the pressure, so
Yeah,
to speak.
yeah,
Put that rather
yeah.
crudely, but I think you understand. But that wouldn't apply to the system that we're considering, would it?
In my understanding of the system, no, it wouldn't. To be quite honest, it's something because we know that the doors will be propped open by the brigade's hoses that we generally look to demonstrate. I can't honestly say I've ever seen a system fail because of it. I know anecdotally of a pressurisation system failed when somebody cut a socket for the cleaner's hoover in the actual wall of a protected shaft. It's
Yeah.
that finely balanced.
Right. Thank you very much.
So we know that the 2 metres per second was the performance criteria for this system. So focusing on that rather than pressurization, depressurization for a moment. And that was proposed on the basis that it would have been adequate to ensure, so that it would have ensured an adequate means of escape. How is it that the BCB would know that that adequate means of escape in the form of that flow rate would always be achieved depending on all these different scenarios unless it was tested?
They wouldn't. The design engineer would have carried out his calculations on the basis of the information given to him and what he observed on site, etc. That design is then given to others to build, to formulate. Tolerances, etc., may not have been maintained. Until that system is up and running, whilst everybody's fingers are crossed, it will follow the design intent until it's actually tested and it's shown at the commissioning that everything is literally joined up and doing what it's supposed to do in the various scenarios it's required to address. Then nobody knows that it's actually working and achieving that particular flow rate.
So it would then be important to check whether the 2 metres per second was maintained with other doors on the floor below, for example, open to the stair. Even if, in principle, you were sceptical that it would make a difference, it's important to test it to make sure.
Yes. It's good, it's best practice, shall we say.
On the issue of the force of the door, you note at paragraph 257 of your supplementary report that there's no record of Mr. Hanson measuring the door opening force. That's on page 64.
Correct.
In his evidence, he said that the commissioning report didn't include the readings of door opening forces and said that building control were relying on the professionalism of the installer and designer. Was that a reasonable approach for the building control to take?
If he hadn't seen any records that the force on the doors had been tested, no, it wouldn't. Did not somebody from JS Wright say that they, with Mr. Hanson, no, they tested them and recorded them, and it was no more than 85 newtons, and that Mr. Hanson relied on his being able to open the door without any undue force, I think was the way it was phrased. I think that was in Mr. White's evidence, oral evidence.
Yes. So where that had happened, was that sufficient for building control's assessment of whether the system was adequate and compliant?
I'll be quite blunt, it was fine until you get found out. That's just a fact. That is why you should record these things, or get somebody to record them and submit that detail to you, or get them to perform the test and you witness it and get them to record it and copy it to you.
Moving on to the topic of dampers, in his evidence, Mr. Hansen said that he just considered B1 and B5 and did not consider how the system would in any way affect internal fire spread or building compartmentation. Was that, in your view, a reasonable approach for him to take?
No, it was not. B1 and B5 rely on all other aspects, all other requirements of the building regulations under Part B.
And does that feed into your overall conclusion that the final certificate should not have been issued?
Correct.
Mr. Hansen said that he considered the basic specification for the dampers to make sure that they were appropriate, and he told the inquiry that the type of damper being used was a smoke control damper because it was being used to control smoke, and it did, he said he believed, and the references for the transcript are day 154, page 204, line 2 to day 154, page 205, line 7. Was that level of scrutiny of the dampers by building control appropriate in your view?
No. The damper required fire resistance to perform the function of a protected shaft, a firefighting shaft. It was critical, particularly in the context of B5, as I've said in my report, it's the last way a firefighter at risk can evacuate the building. It's the point of retreat for them. They fall back to it. And they evacuate people via the shaft if they need to by rescuing them.
The inquiry heard evidence from Mr. Jones of the damper supplier Gilbert's to the effect that the Series 54 dampers were not intended to be, nor were described as being, smoke control dampers. The inquiry also has seen product documentation that referenced test standards applicable to fire and fire smoke dampers, not smoke control dampers. And Mr. Jones also acknowledged that the Series 54 damper had no formal certification at all. Would you have expected a reasonably competent BCB without the benefit of a mechanical and electrical engineer to recognise that the dampers were not a smoke control damper?
Yes, because they should have asked for full details of the damper and should have asked for the test results for the damper.
So was it reasonable then for Mr. Hansen to conclude that the damper being used was a smoke control damper, sort of put in inverted commas there, just because it was being used to control smoke?
No, because it had two functions, fire resistance and smoke.
Can we just look now at a change in the design after...
Can I just
yes.
intervene to ask you how you're getting on?
I was going to ask this question and then propose a break.
Oh, that's right.
Because I'm not going to reach the end of my questions
No, that's
before,
right. Yes, you take your course.
before the transcriber needs a break. So, yes, I'm just asking you about this change to the design, which we can see described in Mr. Money's first witness statement, which is PSB 401329, page 11. And it's subparagraph 3 there. In this part of his statement, Mr. Mane is explaining some of the key changes in the design that occurred as the technical submission progressed through the project. And as we know, there were 6 revisions to that technical submission. He says there that as well as the configuration of the extended smoke shafts, another detail which was finalised after the initial design work recorded in revision 1 of the technical submission was the specification and location of the fan sets used in the system. And just to summarise what he says there is that initially it was envisaged that the north and south smoke shafts would be connected at roof level. That design then changed, and a new arrangement was reflected in revision 5 of the technical submission onwards, which he also confirmed with JS Wright. Was that change in design something that should have been considered by building control, given that it post-dated the Rev 3 technical submission?
Yes, I would have expected building control to have been advised of a change in the design. even if it was simply to allow them to check it out on site when they were conducting their inspections. You could turn up, look at something and say, well, that's what we approved and that's what you've got on site. What happened in between?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That would be an appropriate.
Is that a good point?
Right.
Thank you very much. Well, Ms. Menzies, we'll have time for a break for the morning. We'll stop now. We'll resume at 25 to 12, please. And as with everyone else, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're away.
Okay,
All right?
thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. 25 to 12. Thank you. Would you ask Mrs. Menzies to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, Mrs. Menzies, ready to carry on?
Thank you.
Good, thank you. Yes, Ms. Grogan?
Thank you. We're moving on to commissioning now. In his evidence, Mr. Hanson explained that he looked at the system's commissioning certificate as best he could, but that not being a mechanical and electrical engineer, the commissioning certificate is not something that he could interrogate as well as a mechanical and electrical engineer could do. He also explained that with the loss of the mechanical engineer, we weren't expected to go down and witness commissioning or any kind of inspection. And the references for the transcript for that are day 154, page 49, line 25, and day 154, page 147, lines 11 to 13. How common was it for building control bodies to employ an M&E engineer at that time, so the 2012 to 2016 period?
Probably not common. I think, as Mr. Hanson alluded to, when the GLC was disbanded, the BREG, the Building Regulation Electrical Engineers group, was dispersed, as were surveyors, and various ones went to all the London boroughs. And as time went by, they either moved on or they retired. And due to mostly cost cutting, their positions were not replaced. Also, sorry, if I may add, with the loss of the Section 20, a role disappeared. Now, that went into the building regulations to an extent, but whereas under the protocol that was adopted by the GLC for Section 20, when BREG went out and periodically witnessed the testing, etc., of firemen's lifts, firefighting lifts, whatever you want to call them, and safety lighting, smoke control systems and the like, that was no longer done. The government was at great pains to lift the burden, deregulate the legislation, and put the onus on the person carrying out the work to achieve and display compliance.
So against that background, would you expect a reasonable BCB to be able to consider a commissioning report without the assistance of an M&E engineer?
Yes, a reasonably experienced one, in as much as what you don't gather from the commissioning that you expect to see, you ask. That's the role of building control, is to question and to check things are as they would expect to demonstrate compliance.
Could you just expand on that? So in the absence of an M&E engineer, what would you expect a BCB such as Mr. Hanson to do when it came to inspection and commissioning of the system? If he wasn't, the reason building control generally do not accept invites to go to commissioning, because it's a very lengthy process, as I said before, and all they're really interested in is in the results, not how if you balance damper 55 and then tweak damper 62, you'll end up with what you want. They're not interested in that. They're just interested in the end results. But looking at the commissioning certificate, you would expect all the smoke detectors to have been tested in as much as they were activated by artificial smoke to run, to make sure that when they activated, they opened the vents that they were required to open, to close vents that they were required to open, etc. You wouldn't be looking at for anything as regards the wiring other than to the commissioning certificate to say it was installed as required. So would it follow then that you'd expect the commissioning documentation to lay out in a fair bit of detail that all of the relevant things had been carried out?
Yes, what I would have expected is what was given to building control in the form of, I think, 3 separate documents, i.e., well, it was 4 documents. It was the partial commissioning certificate, as they termed it, which was for floors 4 and above, because the lower floors weren't completed at the time. There was then a commissioning certificate that related to the building as a whole, but it didn't say whether it tested all the floors at the same time. And then there was a separate sheet without heading that was established was the flow rate readings, and another sheet that was the environmental flow rate readings. So I would have expected a proper commissioning certificate to have incorporated all that information and not be a few A4 sheets stapled together, shall we say.
And on receipt of the A4 sheets stapled together as you describe it, is there anything you would have expected Mr. Hanson to do?
Either say thank you very much, I note the content and I'm satisfied, or this is inadequate, I expect to see X, Y, and Z. Neither of which I understand was the response.
Paragraph 291 of your report, which is on page 68, you say that in your experience, systems are generally demonstrated on site using...
Do you want this up on the screen?
No, it doesn't need to come up on the screen. Generally demonstrated on site using a cold smoke test, and that's something you've mentioned earlier in your evidence. And that while that wouldn't fully replicate an actual fire situation, it would be indicative. And you say that this doesn't appear to have been suggested or undertaken. Can you explain to us exactly how it would work in practice in a building such as Grenfell, which was occupied?
A cold smoke test?
Yes.
You would gain permission from one of the residents to access their flat, and then you would set off a cold smoke machine. It's a theatrical smoke machine. Generally smells of like baby talcum powder, really, and it's just thick white smoke, which is discharged from a small electrical canister, electrical device. And then you would open the front door. That would activate the smoke detection. And then you would observe what happened to the smoke as the system did what it's supposed to do. And it would give you an idea of the direction of flow towards the grills into the shaft, away from the staircase. It would, in that particular case, if you left it running long enough to fill the lobby, or you could purposely fill the lobby with smoke, see what was the situation in the dead ends that have been mentioned, and just to give an overall impression of what the system would do. It doesn't reflect fully, obviously, the energised smoke from a fire, but it will give you, in fact, because it's cooler smoke and not as buoyant and not as active, it will give you a better indication of the way that the system is pulling the smoke.
Do you know what is the nature of the smoke that's generated?
Off the top of my head, no, it's just what they use in theatres.
And I ask the question because I just wonder whether it contains very fine particulate matter, which sometimes is the way in which smoke detectors operate, I believe. And if so, where does all the particulate matter end up? You can breathe it. It's safe to be in and breathe because it's used in theatres. And then the smoke detection would generally work on obscuration. All right.
Ionisation. Smoke detectors are frowned upon because they have a radioactive element in them.
Right.
So as soon as that beam in the head is obscured by the smoke, the white smoke in this case, then it will activate.
All right. Thank you.
As far as I'm aware, the particulates can't be large because you don't walk away covered in white dust or anything.
Well, that's rather what I was wondering, particularly if you were going to fill the whole lobby with smoke.
No, it gets extracted away. What is the best thing you can do is do a hot smoke test, but obviously nobody wants to do one of those and set fire to it. You could demonstrate a proposal in a derelict building by doing a hot smoke test, and there are descriptions of doing hot smoke tests, but then I'd say they're never done these days.
Thank you.
And if a cold smoke test had been carried out, would one have been able to look at the different door opening scenarios that we discussed before the break to see what the effect on the flow direction or the flow rate might be?
Yeah, I don't see why not. It would demonstrate what would be happening with smoke, yes.
And could it help to identify whether there were breaches in compartmentation up through the dampers in the shaft?
It would have been a good way to observe it. What has been done in past, if you suspect there is a failure in compartmentation, you would put coloured smoke in an area and see if you could see it on the other side of the compartmentation. That's been done. That's to demonstrate whether it's good or bad compartmentation.
Mr. Hansen said that he was not aware that carrying out a cold smoke test is important in any system where there are extended travel distances, although he accepted it could be a useful guide. And Mr. Partlow said that he would have considered a cold smoke test to be dangerous in an occupied building. In light of that evidence, are you still of the view that a cold smoke test should have been considered and undertaken?
I think it would have been reasonable to consider it. I've never heard of it being an issue in an occupied building.
I think the question is not whether it would have been reasonable to do it, but whether it was unreasonable not to have done it.
I think in this particular case it would have been reasonable because you had an existing situation, existing layout and construction of which you did not know all the intricacies and the voids, etc.
Did the failure to carry it out fall below the standard that you would expect of a reasonable BCB? Or the failure to request that it was carried out?
I think I'm going to say yes in this particular case, yes, particularly with an experienced BCB.
One of Dr. Lane's concerns about the system is that it may have drawn smoke from the fire flat into the lobby. Should that issue have been considered by the BCB?
Yes. However, I would say that in my view, it's inevitable if you extract from the lobby, you will at some point draw smoke from the fire flat. The cold smoke test would have indicated whether that was excessive or not.
Moving on to a topic that you've already mentioned, which is the make-up air and the additional vent proposed by Mr. Hansen. If we go to your report at page 68, paragraphs 296 and 297, you say there that you are not satisfied that the issue of the make-up or input air in the ground floor entrance was resolved, and you conclude that the commissioning report did not relate to the system as installed, and as such the commissioning report should not have been accepted as part of the evidence of compliance that resulted in the BCB issuing a building regulations completion certificate, and you give the date there. This relates to, as you've identified, the suggestion by Mr. Hansen that an additional vent be added after the commissioning had been undertaken,
yes,
and then no additional commissioning process was carried out. In those circumstances where the BCB suggests a change to the system, what further commissioning would you expect to have been undertaken after that?
The whole system, to see that everything had any additional connections to other parts that already had been commissioned, had been dealt with. It may not have been to the depth of the original, but as the lower floors had not had an in-depth commissioning undertaken, because the available commissioning report only related to the floors above the lower levels, there was no overall commissioning report that related to the building as completed.
Can we go to Mr. Hansen's evidence on this in the transcript, which is day 154, page 160? And it's line 15 there. He's asked, do you want to just clarify exactly what was being requested by building control? And he says, yes, okay, so after witnessing of what I call the sequence testing, and then he explains what that is, there was a lobby there which was existing that didn't have any ventilation at all. So just a little bit of background on this. He says, generally speaking, if I see something that could be improved in the building, I mention it to the design team. And then we see that again. Sorry, I think the reference I've got for this is wrong. But what Mr. Hansen's evidence was, if I can summarise, is that this wasn't something that he could legitimately ask for as a matter relevant to compliance. It was an improvement that he was suggesting. In light of that evidence, is it still your view that an additional commissioning process should have been carried out?
Yes, because although it may have been a suggestion on his part, it was adopted and therefore affected the system as finalised.
Just a few, we've just got two topics left. The first one is the involvement of the London Fire Brigade, again on the commissioning. We've covered the consultation with the London Fire Brigade in Module 1. These questions relate specifically to the commissioning and testing. If we could first go to the 2015 SCA guide at page 56, which is RBK 402932. And under 9.1 introduction, the text says, as smoke control systems are primary life safety systems and or for assistance to the fire and rescue services, it is imperative that the smoke control system is tested by the installer and then offered for witness testing to the authority having jurisdiction to prove its compliance with the project specification and the approved design criteria. Authority having jurisdiction is defined on page 9 of that guidance. So if we go there, and you'll see it's the first one, the organisation, office or individual responsible for enforcing the requirements of legislation or standards or for approving equipment, materials, an installation or a procedure. I just want to understand what your understanding of that guidance is. Is the authority having jurisdiction the LFB, the BCB, both, or neither?
Both. The BCB under the building regulations and the fire authority, i.e. the fire service, the London Fire Brigade in this case, under the fire safety order. But you would do that, you would invite the local fire service as well, because it's familiarisation. They're the ones that are going to turn up and fight the fire. It's in your interest for them to know how that particular system works.
Does the fact that the LFB witnessed the commissioning of the smoke system on the 28th of April 2016 have any bearing on your views about RBKC's approach to the commissioning process?
No.
So would it have been reasonable for the BCB to rely on the fact that the LFB had been there and hadn't raised any objections?
I wouldn't have expected the LFB to make any comment on their witnessing the commissioning unless it was their opinion that there was something wrong with the system from their operational point of view or otherwise.
The final topic that we have to cover is the gasworks in 2017. So we're moving on now from the refurbishment to the gasworks. You covered these in your first report, and for the transcript, that references BMER 604, page 156 onwards. I want to look at the advice given by Mr. Allen to Janice Ray of the TMO about whether the gasworks were controllable under the building regulations. So if we could go to TMO 1, 16546, page 3, which is the beginning of an email chain on the matter. You see at the bottom there, Miss Ray tells Mr. Allen that the new riser has been, Mrs. Ray tells Mr. Allen that National Grid is fitting a new riser to Grenfell, and they've told her that building regulations approval is not required. She asks him to confirm that this is correct, and if we go further up the page, we see that on the basis of the information she gives him, he agrees that the work is a repair, providing that no change to fire safety implications are there, and so no application would be required. So he says, I'm content that this work would be regarded as a repair, with that caveat. And it's right, you agree with the initial advice he gave based on the information he received from Janice Ray?
On the basis it was a repair of an existing installation, yes.
Going up to page 2 of the same document, we see another email. You can't see the date on that page because it's on page 1, but the date of the email is the 24th of March 2020, so we moved forward in time a little. Ms. Ray tells Mr. Allen that the new riser has been installed in a new location, and if we go up to page 1, we see an email at the top on the 3rd of April 2017 from Mr. Allen, where he advises that they do not usually take a building regulation application for this type of work, and he would still regard it as a repair. And in your report, your view is that the installation of a gas riser in a new location was controllable under the building regulations.
Yes.
And that's because the venting of the gas pipe duct into the stair was detrimental to escape and affected the integrity of the stair as a firefighting stair?
Yes, the riser had been moved in its position. It had been installed within the stair. By virtue of it being a gas riser, it would be in a position whereby it would ventilate any leak that emanating from the steel conduit that it was made of. The purpose, I understand from speaking to gas engineers prior to this inquiry and subsequently, is that they want people to be able to smell the gas. Positioning in the only escape stair from a tall building, by any stretch of the imagination, I don't think would be acceptable. The fact that it is the intention that it is for people to sniff the gas basically underwrites the fact that it's expected that it will at some stage leak, and to have a combustible gas in the only escape route and the firefighting shaft is very bad practice. It is also governed, in my view, under the building regulations in that this is an adverse effect on the existing arrangements and is therefore a material alteration.
And potentially falls foul of the non-worsening principle.
It does, yes.
So what you're saying is the building regulations, which impose legal requirements, would be inconsistent with putting the riser where it was relocated.
The building...
ultimately, that's a question of law, I suppose, but...
Well, it would be, in my view, the works as undertaken made the situation worse in respect of fire safety. That invoked the building regulations by a worsening of the situation. That meant that the building control body would require an application with proposals that would justify it where it was, if you like. This is after the event because it was put in. And then you would look at the guidance in relation to gas installations in buildings, having regard to the fact this was an escape stair and that it was a firefighting shaft. Now, ADB is not the most straightforward as regards the installation of gas in a stair, and it effectively says you can install it if you have it in a conduit, a gas pipe that complies with the gas safety regs X, Y, and Z. It then says if you enclose it for aesthetic or other reasons, you have to vent it top and bottom. Mm-hmm. Positioned in the positioned in the stair, it was not ventilated top and bottom, and it was enclosed. It was only ventilated at the top, as I understand it, unless it was ventilated into another escape route, i.e. the escape route from the stair at the bottom. But also, all the guidance in relation to a firefighting shaft says you shall not have any service within that shaft that is not related to the functioning of the firefighting shaft. If you enclose the gas riser, you effectively, in practice or otherwise, take it out of the firefighting shaft. But you would have to take it out by construction that was imperforate and attained 2 hours fire resistance. Now, the TMO was informed by the gas undertaker that they were going to enclose it. When I went down to site, it was partially enclosed because I think the fire occurred in the interim. But the protection was actually on the firefighting shaft side, on the stair side, where you would not expect the attack of fire to come from. It should have been, in my view, on the inside of the stud that was separating the gas riser from the stair.
So, in effect, to summarise your view, what Mr. Allen ought to have done was say this is controllable under the building regulations, and therefore I need to see justification as to why these proposals are compliant or no worse.
Yes, I think he should, one of the first things he should have said to her, yes, it is controllable, and I can tell you now it won't be acceptable if you're siting it in a firefighting shaft, or it has been sited in a firefighting shaft. Then I would imagine, and this is just to illustrate it, she would have said, but it's already in there. And then I think Mr. Allen should have been saying words to the effect, well, in that basis, if you're not going to move it, then we expect it to be separated to the required 2-hour standard from the stair.
The inquiry's gas expert, Mr. Hancox, gave evidence that Mr. Allen's advice, as contained in that email, was a common position taken by BCBs, and the reference for that is day 161, page 21, line 18. Is this an issue then on which there might be a range of reasonable expert opinion from the building control side of things?
I don't know if Mr. Hancock was actually referring to buildings of this height that contain firefighting shafts, but a reasonably competent building control surveyor shouldn't have known that a firefighting shaft, by virtue of the recommended standard, shouldn't have anything in it that did not support the functioning of the firefighting shaft.
If we perhaps just go to his evidence so you can see what he was asked and what his response was. It's, as I said, day 161, page 21. And it's there, line 18. In 2016, would a gas engineer have expected their work on a replacement riser to be controllable work under the building regulations and subject to building control approval? And he says no.
Does he mean by replacement like for like? i.e. same service in the same position?
We can check that to see what the basis on which the question was put to him. Are you aware that this issue prompted the works that we're actually looking at, so the installation in a stair in a tall building, would have prompted a different range of responses from different BCBs?
I know it should have prompted, it is controllable. I suspect there are some that would not have had that reaction on the basis that it is permitted, if you like, under the guidance within ADB, subject to certain conditions. But where you have a firefighting shaft, you have that additional consideration. It is an issue, this aspect of venting gas supplies. Just by way of illustration, I was carrying out a fire risk assessment in a conversion from the 1980s of a rather large, in its day, very grand house that had been converted into small flats in the 70s. And the time had come to replace the gas supply. And the one staircase, the gas engineer, when I got to the place, was in fact venting the gas supply into the main entrance hall in the ground floor, taking the pipes then into a riser and up to the top, venting at the top and venting into the hall below, which was obviously, in my view, was unacceptable, and so the arrangement was changed. But I think there is a belief that if an accredited gas contractor undertakes the work, everything will be fine. People are quite rightly are somewhat scared of gas because of it goes bang on occasion. But in the context of fire safety under the building regulations, it is a recognised phenomenon. We know it occurs. We know it goes into stairs. We have standards that go with that. If you deviate from those standards or you want to enclose it aesthetically, there are further standards, but there are additional standards that relate to a firefighting shaft.
So would it have been reasonable for the BCB to take any comfort from the fact that the gas transporter, in this case Cadent, was ultimately responsible for those works?
Not on the basis that they were not compliant with the standards required at the time. The actual installation of the gas may have been perfectly okay. Its location and its location within the firefighting shaft was unacceptable. Did Cadent know it was a firefighting shaft? I don't know.
You say you consider that a building notice would have been reasonable, but that some authorities would have required a full plans application.
Yep, the reason for that is that the building regulations and the RRO legislation require that where a building is or will be subject on completion to the RRO, then a full plans application is the only route under the building regulations. And that is to ensure that the necessary consultation takes place in a quite formal manner. However, that requires quite a process. A building notice with a simple description would have achieved the same function because, in my opinion, the answer would have been no, you can't put it there. So there was effectively no need to consult the fire service because the answer from the building regs aspect, the BCB enforces the building regs, the answer was no, it shouldn't be there. But I can quite understand any other building control body saying, no, we require a full plans application.
And strictly as a matter of the regulations, because this was a building that would be subject to the RRO, it should have been a full plans application.
Yes. Yes, in the context it was adversely affecting the existing fire safety arrangements, yes, and it was a material alteration, yes.
Thank you, Ms Menzies. That's the end of my prepared questions for you. So now would be a time for a break to see if anything else has come in.
Right. Well, as you already know, I'm sure, Ms Menzies, we have to have a break now to enable council just to check that nothing's been left out and to enable others who are not present in the room to suggest questions that perhaps we should put to you. So we'll break now. We'll come back at 12:25 and see if there are any further questions.
Okay, thank
All
you.
right. Thank you very much. We'd like to go to the usher. All right, 12:25, please. Could I ask Ms Menzies to come back in, please? Right, well, let's see if there are any more questions, shall we? Yes, Ms Grogan?
Thank you. We do not think there are any further questions that we need to ask
Right.
at this stage.
Good. All right. Thank you very much. Well, Ms Menzies, it really just remains for me to thank you very much yet again on behalf of the panel and the inquiry as a whole for all the work you've put into your expert reports and, of course, coming here today and yesterday to give us your oral evidence. I mean, I need hardly say that we're very grateful to you.
It's been my pleasure.
Very helpful and very interesting. And as I said, we're going to profit greatly from what you've told us.
I hope so.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
All right,
Bye-bye.
Thank you. You're free to go, of course. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Ms Grogan. That was our last witness for the day, so we're going to call a halt at that stage. And that will complete the inquiry's hearings for this month. We shall not be sitting during August, but we shall resume at 10 o'clock on the 6th of September.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.